of panic disorder. It's going to be both, um, sorry, just making sure if that's recording. Okay. Cognitive behavioral therapy for the treatment of panic disorder. I am going to go over with you what the definitions are going to be here in a minute, but it is going to discuss with and without agoraphobia. So we're going to go into that. I am mindful it says 7 to 8 p.m. We're getting started late and I might go a little bit over because it's being recorded. Don't worry too much if you do have to pop out or what have you. But we're just going to kind of go with the flow and see where it takes us. So I'm going to get started here. Alrighty, so the first thing that I'm going to go through is just a general overview. I think it's really important that we get kind of a bit of an overview into what I'm going to discuss here today. It is very much reduced in size to what I am going to discuss, but to give you a vague kind of idea, we're going to start with definitions and some diagnostic criteria for panic disorder and/or agoraphobia. Then we're going to dive into prevalence rates, etiology, and prognosis. I will define those terminology to make sure that you understand what they are as well when we get to those sections. And then we're going to go into kind of the bulk of the presentation where we do dive into talking about the cognitive behavioral therapy treatment option. We'll talk about what it is. We'll go over the cognitive model, go through each of the components, and we'll also talk a little bit about ICBT, which is the internet delivered version, because as we know, we've kind of since COVID become accustomed to that being a very widely used treatment method. Number 4, we're going to go into actually the COVID-19 implications because as you can imagine, that kind of shifted a bit for individuals who were experiencing panic disorder and agoraphobia and definitely played a role. Then I'll go into discussing the therapeutic alliance. So that's kind of the relationship between the therapist and the client to ensure that there's a level of comfort and safety for you guys. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a demonstration. There's not going to be any obligation for you to stick around for it if you wouldn't like to participate, but we're going to do a demonstration of just a relaxation exercise. And then I'm going to put together the concluding remarks, have a little discussion there. And then after that point, once concluded, we will stop the recording and then open up for questions. We will also offer up a survey as well that will be emailed to you so that if you have questions or comments that you don't want to be kind of asked in front of everybody else, we can also answer those private for you at a later date. So we're going to start with some definitions, as I mentioned here. I'm going to go into the panic disorder being defined, the agoraphobia being defined. We'll go into the diagnostic criteria, and then I'm going to show you a video clip. We're going to have a couple video clips throughout the evening, so hopefully they work as planned because technology doesn't love us. I'm convinced it gets tired at the end of the week, just like us. So I'm going to show a couple of those, and then we'll move on from there. So let's start by defining panic disorder. So as per the Canadian Mental Health Association, panic disorder can be defined often by its presence of panic attacks. And this panic disorder almost always causes panic attacks. However, it's really vital to note that panic attacks can occur in the presence of another diagnosed mental illness. So just because you experience panic attacks wouldn't necessarily mean you'd fit into the criteria for panic disorder. So in someone with panic disorder, their attacks may appear to be very repetitive, and when they occur, it's often fairly unexpectedly. They're very sudden, intense, they become fearful, and oftentimes that leads to an unexpected panic, more so when they realize that they're ill-prepared to deal or ill-prepared or ill-equipped to deal with that. And so these attacks, like I said, tend to be sudden and intense. And so often there are physiological responses that come as a result of that. If you've experienced a panic attack, I'm sure you're familiar with what some of those may be, but it can kind of be a combination of things like racing heart, shortness of breath, nausea, not deep breathing whatsoever, right? Those shortness of breath is very like you've got that like hyperventilation kind of response. It might even be vomiting and more. So with panic disorder, panic attacks most often occur for no clear reason, and that's why they're so unexpected. So the individual is almost in constant fear of having one. They don't feel like they really have any control over it. And of course, lack of control makes us extremely fearful. So it isn't unheard of, though, also to experience these panic attacks with a really clear trigger, right? And that could be in addition to those that are unexpected. So there might be a trigger. It might be being in crowds, for example, which we'll discuss. But sometimes there is that lack of reasoning. And in general, the individual continues to be feared of having or fearful of having a panic attack. Next, we'll talk about agoraphobia and define that for a minute. So as we'll kind of go over in the diagnostic criteria here in a few moments, agoraphobia used to exist with panic disorder. Sometimes it can, but it can exist on its own now as well. So agoraphobia differs in the way that, oh my goodness, what just happened to the view? Oh, okay. I think we're good now. Danielle, let me know if we're not. Is it working still?
Doing awesome. There's just a couple little black text boxes.
Why is it doing that? Thank you. Sorry, guys. There we go. Apologies for that. So agoraphobia differs in the way that the fear itself can be a lot more connected to, oh, sorry. There we go. A lot more connected to not being able to escape in the time that somebody is having a panic attack, or at the time when they're experiencing panic-like symptoms, if not a full attack. So they can appear, as I said before, at any time. The agoraphobia comes in because there is that fear of not being able to escape. So further past that, agoraphobia is really that anxiety that occurs when somebody is in public, when they're in a crowded place, they're leaving home, whatever that might be, from where that potential escape is difficult, or where help may not be readily available should they need it. Because panic attacks, as some of you may know, it can often really mimic that feeling of I'm going to die because you're at such a lack of oxygen, you're struggling to breathe. And so not having help is also extremely fearful to these people, and it can often keep them staying around home in their safe spaces. So people with agoraphobia often stick around those familiar and safe areas, and they avoid those crowded or overstimulating places. As I said, panic disorder and agoraphobia are no longer linked directly. In the past, panic disorder was known to exist solely with or without agoraphobia, but now agoraphobia can also be diagnosed on its own. So in past, like I said, they kind of existed with one another, but a panic disorder and agoraphobia are no longer linked directly in the diagnostic manual. They can exist together, but they're not linked directly with one another any longer. I have a little graphic here. What people think agoraphobia is, the fear of leaving your house. Can it be? Absolutely. Can be a component of it. But there are other things too. So if we look at that pie graph, we've got avoiding any place that causes panic, anticipation of anxiety. That concern of feeling anxiety, it's so uncomfortable that that alone, that anticipation of feeling it, can keep a person avoiding from going places. Panic attacks, depression, and avoiding places in general that may lead to feelings of embarrassment. So I'm going to show a video clip from a TED Talk, which, we love. This is one of the ones that I was shown when I was going through my schooling as well. I didn't want to show a full 7-minute video here and eat too much of our time, but I picked a portion of it, of this individual, Linda Bussey, who, like I said, did a TED Talk in Yellowknife about her experiences with agoraphobia. And I thought it would be really great for you guys to be able to hear a bit of a speech done by somebody who's actually experiencing or has experienced it. So we're going to, fingers crossed, get this to work. Okay.
So after working for 5 months, I was in the metro, the same
Danielle, let me know if you can't hear that.
route I took every day, and all of a sudden, I'm between two
You can't hear it? Oh, it is? Okay, good.
metro stations. My legs are tingling. My breath became very heavy. All I wanted to do is yell. So I got up really fast because there was no way I was going to yell in the metro. And I went right away to the doors, and I knew it was my stop. I got there, I got out of the metro, walked up the stairs like I did for 5 months, went to the mall, and all of a sudden my life changed. I dropped my bags. I could not talk. I could not walk. I couldn't even concentrate on my breath. My head was going that way when my body was going the other way. It was like a warp zone. I was totally not there. And I wanted to yell again or run, but nothing was happening. It was it was like an outer body experience. There was this little faint voice in my body that said, it's going to be okay. And it was very faint, but it kept me there. So it seemed like hours. It was just a question of minutes. And people were looking at me very, like questioning what's wrong with her. Nobody stopped, except one colleague stopped and asked me what was wrong. And without a beat, and I said, oh, bad back. I suffer from a bad back. And I don't know what was happening. I just couldn't move. I was able to move with that person, went to the office, called a friend, went home, never went back to work. And that day is still a blur for me. But that night I went to emerge, hoping that I either suffered from a heart attack or I was having something wrong with my brain and that I would need just medical attention and everything would be okay. Well, the ER doctor that night, I think I puzzled him a little bit with everything that was happening and told me, you don't need me, you need a psychiatrist. Go home now and figure this out. So I did go home, went in my bedroom, and I stayed there for 2 years. I would only come out of my bedroom to go to therapy once or twice a week, and only with some friends, my boyfriend, or my father. I was raised with a family that achievers. I have a mother who was before her time in the work world. She went back to school when she was 56, and she became a social worker. I have a father that was a mayor, so he was mayor for 12 years in a Norton community north of Montreal. And I have a brother who's an athlete, a very accomplished athlete, and a very good-looking man. But it was okay because when I was young, I made money selling his picture at the community arena. So I did. My weekends were great. But so I would only leave my room to go to therapy. I did go back to school in that semester. They allowed me to take 1 or 2 courses, but I could not move. I had to be driven everywhere I went. My family did not understand what was happening. They were caring, but we didn't talk about it. I figured out that summer. We were told that there was mental health issues in our family. It wasn't brushed away, but it wasn't talked about. We acknowledged it, but did nothing about it. So a year and a half after going to therapy, and my dad used to leave his workplace, come and get me at my house, bring me to therapy, the other end of Montreal, bring me back to wait while I was in therapy, bring me back home. He did that for a year and a half without saying nothing except that he just felt he had to do this. So I owe a lot to my dad. After a year and a half in therapy, the therapist decided it was time to do an exposure intervention. I was going to take the metro alone. And with nobody can come, and it was time to do it. I had to face my trigger.
So we're going to leave it at that because I'm going to go into talking about exposure therapy in a bit. But if this is something that you're interested in your own time in watching kind of in totality, you can just put in agoraphobia, the fear of fear into YouTube, and you'll get the full-length video that will come up there. Okay. So now we're going to have a bit of a discussion on the diagnostic criteria for panic disorder and agoraphobia. So for those of you that don't know, DSM-5 stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. It's getting quite old at this point, but it's still kind of our newest one. We did have a recent text revision, but very little was kind of changed. However, this being the newest one, we are kind of phrasing it in the way of saying that they've kind of been disconnected, panic disorder and agoraphobia, in the most recent edition here. So let's go through briefly the panic disorder diagnostic criteria first. So the way that this is set up in the diagnostic manual is we've got the diagnostic criteria. So it gives you kind of at the top here where it says A, it gives you a little bit of an explanation of the main aspect of that diagnostic criteria, and then it gives kind of those subcategories or subsymptoms. And what that does is it allows you to go through, because there's usually a portion of them that have to be met, but not all of them. So let's look at this criterion A. So as it says here, recurrent and unexpected panic attacks. A panic attack is an abrupt surge of intense fear or intense discomfort that reaches a peak within minutes and during which time 4 or more of the following symptoms occur. So like I said, we don't need all 13, just 4 or more. I will be clear and say that psychiatrists, psychologists are ones who, do official diagnoses for these kinds of things, but it is important to kind of go through this diagnostic criteria just to understand what that kind of exists and the components of that. So let's go through each of these 13. Number 1, palpitations, pounding heart, accelerated heart rate. Number 2, sweating. Number 3, trembling or shaking. Number 4, sensations of shortness of breath or smothering. Number 5, feelings of choking. Number 6, chest pain or discomfort. Number 7, nausea or some form of abdominal distress or pain. 8, feeling dizzy, unsteady, lightheaded, faint. Number 9, chills or kind of on the other end of the spectrum, heat sensations. 10, paresthesias or numbness or tingling sensations. 11, derealization. So that's those feelings of like being in another world, or as the lady in the video said, that outworldly feeling of that unreality. Or depersonalization, feeling very detached from yourself. I'll often explain this to clients as, you're sitting back and watching yourself act or experience this panic attack. You're eating popcorn, but you have no control over what you're doing, that detachment. 12, fear of losing control or fear of quote unquote going crazy. And then 13, the fear of dying. So like I said, we only, if I was a psychologist, psychiatrist that was diagnosing, we just look for 4 or more of those symptoms. Now we have criterion B. This is set up very similarly, and it looks at least one of the attacks that you've experienced has been followed by 1 month or more of one or both of the following things. 1, persistent concern, persistent worry about having another panic attack and the consequences or what those panic attacks will cause. For example, that losing control, the having a heart attack, the worries of going quote unquote crazy. And number 2, a significant maladaptive change in behavior related to the attacks. So for example, behaviors that are designed to avoid panic attack, like staying home, avoidance of exercise, avoidance of unfamiliar situations, because when we're in unfamiliar situations, we feel like we have less control. Maybe we do have less control. Maybe it's just perceived, but we kind of go through that defense mechanism. And so one of those or both. Then we've got C and D, which are important to kind of go over in relation to that 1 and 2. So C, the disturbance cannot be attributable to the physiological effects of a substance. So we have to be really careful. Most of the diagnostic criteria have this there. As you, I'm sure, are aware, specific or certain substances can really alter reality for a person and can cause a lot of physiological effect. So if this is happening due to being on a substance, then we can attribute that to panic disorder or another medical condition similarly to that. And then D, the disturbance is not better explained by another mental disorder as well. So as it says here, the example, the panic attacks didn't occur in response to a feared social situation. You're in public and there's a shooter there. We expect you to have a panic response, right? So it's more when they're in these situations where they're not necessarily a true risk, but they've got that like perceived risk or true perceived feeling of fear. In response to circumscribed phobic objects or situations, as in specific phobias as well, OCD, things like that. So there were some major changes to agoraphobia, like I said before, when they separated it from panic disorder. And so this stuff is fairly new. They are no longer paired together and not attached by any means. So agoraphobia requires that the individual must meet and experience 2 out of the 5 categories. We'll zoom in here. So A, marked fear or anxiety about 2 or more of the following 5 situations. 1, using public transportation. So as you know, that can be automobiles, buses, trains, ships, planes. Unfortunately, in our area, there's not too many options there for public transport on a day-to-day. Number 2, being in open spaces, such as parking lots or marketplaces, bridges. Number 3, being in enclosed spaces. So it's interesting, right? Because it can be in open or closed places, but it really depends on the person. For example, shops, theaters, cinemas, places that tend to be crowded. 4, standing in line or being in a crowd. And 5, being outside of the home alone. This could literally be standing out on the sidewalk in front of your house by yourself. So again, we only need 2 of those. It can be more, but we only need 2 to fit within that criteria. Diagnostic criteria B, the individual fears or avoids these situations mentioned above because of the thoughts that escape might be difficult or help might not be available, like we said before, in the event of developing those panic-like symptoms or other incapacitating or embarrassing symptoms. Fear of falling in the elderly, for example, comes up a lot. If you don't know any elderly individuals, but if you do and you talk to one of them and they've had a fall before, they often do develop that fear of falling again. And sometimes it's really the embarrassment versus actually getting hurt. You'd be surprised at how often that one comes up. Or the fear of incontinence when they go out, if it's an individual that struggles to hold their bodily fluids. C, the agoraphobic situations almost always provoke fear or anxiety. D, the agoraphobic situations are actively avoided. Again, we're going into that avoidance again. They require the presence of a companion or are endured with a lot of fear or anxiety, like intense top of the charts when not with another person. E, the fear or anxiety is out of proportion to the actual danger. This is a really important one because a lot of times, like I said, it's perceived danger, not necessarily actual danger that's posed by that agoraphobic situation and to the sociocultural context. F, the fear, anxiety, or avoidance is persistent, typically lasts for at least 6 months. G, the fear, anxiety, or avoidance causes clinically significant distress, clinically significant impairment in various areas, social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. H, if another medical condition, let's say, IBS, Parkinson's disease, that kind of stuff is present, then fear, anxiety, or avoidance is clearly excessive. Then, of course, that's important to note there. And I, the fear, anxiety, or avoidance isn't better explained by the symptoms of another mental disorder, like I said prior for panic disorder. So, for example, a specific phobia, a situational type, not related exclusively to, obsessions, things like that. We will note kind of at the bottom here, and I know I keep saying it, but it's kind of an important note to make. Agoraphobia is diagnosed irrespective of the presence of panic disorder. If an individual's presentation meets criteria for panic disorder and agoraphobia, both diagnoses should be assigned. So it's not always just one or the other. It can be, but not always. Okay. So we're going to move on to prevalence rates here. So prevalence rates is how common a disorder is of kind of showing up in a population. So we're going to briefly go over the prevalence rates of both panic disorder and agoraphobia. So like I said, prevalence rate refers to the proportion of a population whom of which are diagnosed with a condition during a specified time frame. So it's really important we look at it from there, or it's difficult to measure. So when we have a time frame, we're able to measure a bit better. As you'll see here, we go with a year. So for panic disorder, and these numbers come right from that diagnostic manual we just went through for the DSM-5, 2 to 3% of adolescents and adults are diagnosed on an annual yearly basis. In those over the age of 64, though, the prevalence of it tends to be lower at 0.7%. And even lower than that prior to the age of 14 is a prevalence of 0.4%. So fairly low there. There are some recognized systematic cultural and racial differences for panic disorder as well, which means how often it tends to occur in certain races or ethnicities over others. So it was found that American Indians with higher rates and lower rates have been reported in Asian, African, and Latin American countries. For agoraphobia, however, as reported in the DSM-5 as well, 1.7%, so quite a bit smaller, of adolescents and adults are diagnosed on an annual yearly basis. And then in those over the age of 64, again, quite a bit lower, the prevalence rate at 0.4%. You'll notice here we don't mention under the age of 14 because at that age, you don't really have as much of a choice on whether or not you're going to stay at home and lay in your bed all day. There's a lot more, you've got somebody kind of over you, a parent or guardian and things. So that wasn't included there. However, if I had to make a guess, I would suspect that the prevalence rates for agoraphobia have increased since the COVID-19 pandemic as well, which we will go through coming up here. There were no cultural or racial variances found for agoraphobia like there was with the panic disorder. So the prevalence rates of agoraphobia don't significantly differ between cultures. Okay, so that's kind of it for background. Now we're going to go into etiology and prognosis. I will explain what those are here as well. So etiology is defined as the cause or set of causes of a condition. So why individuals get it, where it might come from. Let's start with panic disorder. So the exact cause of panic disorder is unknown. However, it has been found that there's some sort of, to some degree or form, a genetic component. It might be a close relative has panic disorder. If a close relative does have panic disorder, it's actually found that the risk of that close relative and you getting panic disorder increases by 10 to 20%, which is quite significant. However, stressful life events, caffeine consumption to excess, drug use, especially stimulants, may also trigger an attack as well. In addition to that, separation anxiety, psychological traumas during childhood, they've also been associated with the onset of the disorder as well. Unfortunately, there's no lab test to diagnose panic disorder because the symptoms tend to mimic other disorders, for example, having a heart attack. So unfortunately, diagnosis is frequently not made for years as a result of, which puts a big barrier kind of in an individual who may have it and delays their ability to get treatment. With agoraphobia, the causes are even more so unknown, but there are several risk factors. And what I mean by risk factors are areas that may influence a person's susceptibility to being diagnosed and suffering from agoraphobia. For example, having an alcohol or substance use disorder, experiencing stressful life events of some sort, being female, more females actually have agoraphobia, or having anxiety in general. However, a previous diagnosis of panic disorder is actually the strongest predictor because they do, even though they're disconnected now or can be disconnected, they do tend to exist together still in a large majority of people. Okay, now we're going to go into prognosis. So I know we've got a lot of kind of terms here to familiarize ourselves with, but prognosis is defined as the likely course of a disease or ailment. So how long it's going to run its course in an individual and what it looks like between things like gender, family history, remission and recovery rates, those kinds of things. So we're going to start with panic disorder once again. So we're going to look at gender here for a moment. So females are actually much more frequently affected than males when it comes to panic disorder. So at a rate actually of approximately 2 to 1. So what that means is that for every 2 females diagnosed with panic disorder, there's approximately 1 male that's diagnosed with it. That was kind of a statistic that surprised me because a couple of people I know with it are male. But it's interesting to kind of be able to look at it from that framework. And maybe that's changed since COVID. And hopefully when the new manual comes out, we'll get some new statistics. But for now, this is kind of what the findings show. We've got remission and recovery rates. So episodic outbreaks and remissions. Some individuals may have episodic outbreaks of symptoms that align with their panic disorder diagnosis, often years of remission in between, and others may have continuous and severe symptomology as well. Episodic outbreaks are kind of when it may appear that an individual has recovered, but their panic disorder still presents itself in episodic manner. So that means in periods kind of out of the blue, and that can continue to repeat itself. Only a small minority of individuals have full remission, meaning they completely kind of get themselves healed and away from the disorder without a relapse. Sometimes that relapse is within, a year or two, and a person can believe that they've been in remission, but unfortunately, that's fairly rare. Family history wise, it is believed that multiple genes contribute to panic disorder. However, the exact genes responsible remain unknown. If we look at various neural systems in the brain, such as the amygdala, they have reflected very similar pathways and changes in comparison to other anxiety disorders. So we do tend to infer that there's a similar kind of system of the way it works in our brain as some of those other ones that have been better researched. There is an increased risk as well for panic disorder among children with parents who have also struggled with it. That's the same as, if you're a parent who has anxiety, depression, bipolar, it's very similarly there where the children also have a higher risk because of that. Moving on here to agoraphobia. Similarly, and I know I misspoke earlier because I was speaking about the ratio for agoraphobia when it was panic disorder, but they're actually exactly the same, which is likely why I got confused. So my apologies for that. Females are also more frequently affected than males as well at approximately a rate of 2 to 1. Remission and recovery rates. Achieving remission is possible with agoraphobia more so than PD, but it is fairly rare at about 10%. And that's especially the case if left untreated. If not treated, that's going to be closer to a 0%. So we need it to be treated. So the greater the severity of agoraphobia an individual has, the less likely, unfortunately, that they're able to achieve full remission. And then again, their chances of relapse are higher. And family history. So the diagnostic manual also reports that the family history heritability rate for agoraphobia is about 61%, which is moderately high. So of the phobias that exist, agoraphobia actually has the strongest genetic casualty, meaning that of all the different phobias that are there, if you have family members, close family members that have had agoraphobia, 61% chance that, that also goes to you. So fairly strong. Okay, now we're going to get into the bulkier part of the presentation here. We will have another video clip or two coming up as well to break up a bit of my talking and get me a drink of water. But we're going to start here by just going through what cognitive behavioral therapy is. That's, of course, the most important part, or a lot of this knowledge isn't going to make a lot of sense. So bear with me here as we go through that. If you do already know what it is, we'll just kind of reinforce the knowledge a little bit. So CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is based on the theory that the way that individuals perceive a situation is actually much more closely connected to their reaction than the actual situation itself. So individuals' perceptions are often fairly distorted and they're fairly unhelpful. And that's particularly the case as well when they're distressed. So cognitive behavioral therapy really helps people identify what their distressing thoughts are, allowing them to kind of evaluate how realistic the thoughts are as well. Then they're able to learn how to change that distorted thinking. So it's a process. So when we think more realistically, we tend to feel better. The emphasis is also consistently on solving problems. Initiating changes in behavior is a big aspect of that. So there are some kind of tenets of good CBT. So first one, CBT continuously monitors client progress and goals through collaboration between client and therapist. Collaboration is so important. I always say clients are really the master, the expert of their own lives, and we can really help them kind of bring out those qualities that maybe they're struggling with or provide coping mechanisms that they can then use down the road. So collaboration is very important to mention. It requires efforts from both the client and the therapist side. CBT is culturally adapted as well, so it tailors treatment to the individual, regardless of what culture that individual is from. With some therapies, it does have to be kind of altered according to an individual socioeconomic status or the culture they come from and maybe what the societal norms are. However, with CBT, it tends to be just as efficient for one person as the other, and that's why it's used kind of worldwide pretty significantly. CBT stresses collaboration and active participation. So, of course, showing up to therapy, but also participating in the activities that are going on actively or the homework that is given, as we'll discuss here shortly. CBT also emphasizes the positive. It does have a fairly positive, aspirational, values-based, goal-oriented kind of view to it. It very much emphasizes living in the present moment versus the past or future. And it also includes action plans or therapy homework all of the time. So I want to go through the cognitive model below. It adds a little bit of a visual to it. So we've kind of got a fairly simple stage model here. You've got the situation that happens, And the situation that happens, or sometimes I'll call it the trigger, can also be another word for that situation. Automatic thoughts or beliefs come. You don't really take time to think about it. It's the ones that just like I call popcorn thoughts. They kind of just pop right into your head. And so reaction wise, there's some kind of reaction almost always to what thought we have in whatever form that is. So reactions, we've kind of got three areas for a reaction. We can react emotionally, we can react with a behavior, and we can react with a physiological response. So again, your heart's racing, whatever that might be in terms of those kinds of responses. So it's very much, CBT is very much based on this and figuring out how to alter how we kind of connect these kinds of things, because this is what kind of ends up putting us in that cycle, especially when we are perceiving things to be a lot different than maybe what the reality is. And we get very much in our head, and those, hence the cognitive and behavioral connection. Okay, I'm going to play a video again here. It's nothing too long, and then we'll come back in a second.
Imagine this. You always dreamed of picking up a new hobby like gardening. You try it for a bit, but since hobbies aren't easy to master, your negative thoughts start spinning. I'm terrible at this. I can never do anything right. So you quit and feel a little sad when you pass beautiful gardens in your neighborhood. Sound familiar? Countless studies have shown that cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, can improve depression, anxiety, stress, insomnia, and many other conditions. It is a powerful tool therapists use to help you identify the patterns that exist between your feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. All three are interconnected. The way you feel affects what you think and what you do has a big impact on how you feel and what you think. Most of us have over 6,000 thoughts a day. Imagine your brain is a stream and your thoughts are individual leaves traveling through the current. Some pass through without much fuss, but there are usually a few that we pull out of the stream and hold on to really tightly. CBT challenges you to hold those thoughts at a distance and evaluate them objectively before you act on them and let them dictate how you feel. Ask yourself, is this thought accurate? Is it helpful? CBT also empowers you to change your behaviors. If you're stuck on the thought that you're terrible at gardening, maybe you can start by keeping a simple potted plant alive. Read an article for useful tips, or speak to a neighbor with a green thumb. Your actions can prove your original thought wrong, and you'll notice you'll feel better as a result. By challenging your thoughts like this and seeing them more objectively, in time, CBT can help improve symptoms of depression and anxiety, and be a valuable tool to help you through bumps in your daily life. Remember, you can change your feelings by changing your thoughts and behaviors, which in turn can improve every domain of your life.
There. Who doesn't love a nice cartoon graphic? Alrighty. Okay, now we're going to move on to discussing a little bit of CBT's efficacy for panic attack management. It was established here by a couple of individuals I read a study on. So CBT for treatment of agoraphobia was looked at in both conjunction with and individually with panic disorder. So it was really found that things like exposure therapy, cognitive restructuring, relaxation, breathing training, psychoeducation, homework exercises, all of those were really important within that cognitive behavioral treatment. And there's a lot of success that was shown in that treatment when they've included these aspects, and also when they were in combination with pharmacological interventions. So you'll often find that a lot of individuals who are in therapy tend to also be on an SSRI and antidepressant, things like that as well alongside it. The combination is what has been found to be the most efficient for people. So what we're going to do is we're going to break down some of these facets a bit further in the next several slides. So we're going to start here by talking about exposure therapy. This was what was mentioned in that first video I showed you of the TED Talk of the individual who our therapist said, yep, it's time to have an exposure exercise, you're getting on the bus. So exposure therapy is a technique that's used in CBT that helps individuals face situations or face those things that cause them fear, anxiety, and distress. So an example of that, if you fear speaking in public, then exposure therapy might involve gradual is such an important part. We don't want to go full-fledged right away, gradually speaking in front of a small group of people. Although this might cause some initial discomfort, in fact, we very much expect it to cause discomfort, the aim is really to help you become more comfortable with the fear over time and eventually overcome it. Fear is often reinforced by avoidance. If you're anxious about flying, for example, you might avoid air travel altogether. Or if you fear driving, you may avoid getting behind the wheel. And while avoiding these situations can help you temporarily escape that anxiety, or what I like to say, band-aid it, it can also prevent you from enjoying trips and career opportunities or the freedom to travel and explore the world. And I often say to people that these fears that we kind of put into things, it really holds us back from being able to enjoy a lot of what the world has to offer sometimes. And we find it a lot more difficult to live in the present as well. So the goal of exposure therapy is to break the cycle of avoidance by slowly exposing you to your fears and encouraging you to tolerate is the best word, because we're not asking you to enjoy it, but just tolerate the discomfort until it becomes easier to manage. So with time, you'll then realize that your fears are often less dangerous than they appear, or less dangerous than your brain is telling you they are. And that leads to a much more realistic expectation. For example, you might discover that public speaking doesn't always lead to embarrassment. Maybe you really kill it when you do it, right? Flying isn't as frightening as you maybe imagined. You know, you only had 1 or 2 air pockets when you were flying and you landed safely. It was a smooth flight. Maybe you even had a nap and some peanuts. And driving doesn't always result in accidents. So that kind of stuff. We often live, one of my kind of favorite scenarios I'll use with clients is we often live like these really negative outcomes are likely to happen, when in reality, we should just be living like they're possible. Mostly everything is possible. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's likely to happen. And when we start living like things are possible versus they're likely, we tend to go, okay, cost benefits, let's go for it. The risk is low versus, oh, it's likely to happen. I'm going to miss out on that completely. So let's talk about down here at the bottom, exposure therapy in terms of panic disorder and agoraphobia directly, the implications of that. So exposure therapy is an effective treatment for panic disorder because it helps individuals confront the situations or the physical sensations that trigger panic attacks, and it does it in a safe and controlled way. Panic disorder often really involves intense fear of experiencing a panic attack, which then leads to symptoms or behaviors that line up with avoidance, such as staying away from certain places or staying away from certain activities that might trigger your anxiety. And so that avoidance then reinforces the fear and then prevents you from being able to learn that your fears are often exaggerated, as I said before, or irrational to some degree. So by gradually exposing someone with panic disorder to the situations and sensations that they fear and avoid, like, they're worried about their heart rate going up, they're worried about dizziness or crowded places, exposure therapy helps them learn that these sensations aren't harmful just because they're uncomfortable, right? Sometimes things hurt, but they aren't harmful. And they don't necessarily lead to a panic attack every time either. So over time, this then reduces that response they have to be fearful, reduces that fear response. It allows the person to regain confidence and control. In exposure therapy, what we typically do as the therapist is we start with less intimidating situations and we gradually work up to something more challenging. And this helps an individual then to become what we call desensitized to their triggers. They've done it enough times that they're not as sensitive to it anymore. And when we're not as sensitive to things, we reduce the intensity of them and we reduce the frequency of the panic attacks as well. Furthermore, exposure therapy does help clients realize that panic attacks, even though they're distressing and uncomfortable, aren't life-threatening. And when something isn't life-threatening, as you can imagine, it lessens the anxiety around it to some degree. And then it prevents that cycle we get into of avoiding it and avoiding it and avoiding it. And instead, we start to face it head on. So ultimately, exposure therapy really teaches individuals with panic disorder how to manage anxiety without resorting to avoidance or fear. And that makes it a highly effective and empowering treatment. We've got another little video clip here. I know we're coming up on an hour. I understand, like I said, if anybody needs to go, we've got it recorded, but I'm going to continue with what we have here, and we'll see you on the other side.
The key to graded exposure or systematic desensitization is to break your exposure down into a series of small steps that will gradually lead you to your goal. So you start with a list of about 8 to 12 steps, and then you rate each of these steps on a scale from 1 to 10 in terms of how much anxiety they cause you. And so they form a sort of ladder, with the least anxiety provoking on the bottom and the one that causes you the most anxiety at the top. And then you work your way up through these steps, starting by exposing yourself to the ones that cause you the least amount of anxiety, and then going step by step until you make your way up to the top of the ladder. And so if you have a fear of spiders, your ladder might look something like this. And notice at the bottom of the ladder, we've started with just imagining a spider, because perhaps anything involving an actual real-life spider would be too anxiety-provoking for you to be able to even start. And so you need to make sure that the first rungs on your ladder are manageable. Or if you have social anxiety, your ladder might look something like this. And for some more examples of graded exposure ladders you can use for different types of anxiety, please check out the pinned comment. And then once you've come up with your exposure ladder, you start by exposing yourself to whatever's on the bottom step of the ladder. And when you're exposing yourself, you want to feel a little bit of anxiety, up to about a 3, but anything higher than that can be too much to start with. Now, when you first expose yourself to something, your anxiety might spike a bit. So you want to be prepared for this initial surge of anxiety. And then if you do experience an increase in anxiety, try some anxiety reduction techniques. And then see if your anxiety starts to come back down to a 3 out of 10 or less. And you'll find a whole bunch of strategies to help you manage anxiety in my videos that I link to in the pinned comment. But if your anxiety stays at a level of 4 or above, then you don't want to continue with the exposure because it's causing you too much anxiety right now. And it's going to be a negative experience that's going to increase the amount of anxiety that you associate with this step, rather than be a habituating experience that makes you more comfortable with this step. So if your anxiety stays elevated, then it's time to do the 3 R's: retreat, recover, and repeat. So first, you retreat. And what this means is simply that you stop doing the exposure for now. And then you recover and give yourself a chance to calm down until you're not feeling anxious anymore. And then you repeat and you start the exposure again, and you continue with these steps of retreat, recover, and repeat as often as you need until your anxiety no longer rises above a 3. And continue with your exposure to this step until you become habituated to it and your level of anxiety drops to below a 3. And then you're ready to move on to the next step, which may have been a 4 out of 10 before, but now as you've started to climb that ladder, it's now only a 3 out of 10, which is low enough for you to expose yourself to that. And you keep working your way up the ladder until you've habituated to each of these steps. And eventually you become comfortable even with that step at the top of the ladder, which may have caused you a 10 out of 10 on the anxiety scale before. And now it's down to a much more manageable level of about a 3. And so by gradually exposing ourselves to what's making us anxious, we can conquer even our biggest fears without...
Okay.
Whatever.
All right, so that was a little bit on exposure there. Now I'm going to go through the next component, which is cognitive restructuring. So cognitive restructuring is a therapeutic technique that's used to identify and challenge distorted or irrational thoughts and beliefs that and then replaces them with something more realistic and balanced in terms of thinking. And it's often employed in CBT. And so CBT, as we know, is a highly effective treatment for various mental health conditions like PD and agoraphobia. So how cognitive restructuring works. Basically, what we're doing is we're identifying the negative thoughts. So the first step is identifying the negative or unhelpful thought is that an individual has. And these thoughts often arise during situations that are distressing or situations where there are moments of anxiety. For example, someone with a panic disorder, may think I'm going to die or I can't handle this. The second part is challenging the thoughts. So after you identify the negative thoughts, we then, as therapists, help the individual question the evidence for and against these thoughts. For example, if someone thinks, I will have a panic attack in public, then I might say to them, has this happened every time you've went out? What evidence do you have that this will happen now? The third is replacing. So we're replacing with realistic thoughts. It's a really important part. Once the person has critically examined the distorted thoughts, they replace them with more realistic, balanced thoughts. For instance, instead of thinking I'll die, they might think I've had panic attacks before and I was fine afterward. The physical sensations I'm experiencing are just anxiety. They aren't a sign of danger. And finally, reinforcement, practice and reinforcement. So over time, individuals can practice recognizing and replacing their negative thoughts, because what that does is it strengthens their skills or ability to manage anxiety and panic in real world situations where they can apply it. In terms of the implications aligning with panic disorder and agoraphobia in the bottom half there are some benefits. So people with panic disorder often experience very sudden and intense episodes of fear or anxiety, as we know, that are accompanied by physical symptoms. And this leads to a lot of catastrophic thinking. So catastrophic thinking term comes from catastrophe, right? There's constant that feeling that there's going to be a catastrophe when maybe the risk is non-existent or a heck of a lot smaller than catastrophic. Maybe fearing that the panic attack will cause them to lose control and die. So cognitive restructuring really allows, challenges those catastrophic thoughts and teaches individuals that panic attacks, even though they're unpleasant, like I said before, are not life-threatening and that they can cope with them. When it comes to agoraphobia, very much like I said before, characterized by fear of being in situations where you can't escape or there might not be help. And so the individuals avoid these situations due to the fear of panic attack. And so through cognitive restructuring, we can allow these individuals to start to learn and to recognize that their fears are exaggerated and that they can safely engage in those kinds of situations. This really helps to reduce avoidance behaviors and really encourages the gradual exposure we talked about before to some of those feared situations. Along the side here, as I kind of just went through at the top, is the ABC model that I very, very, very often use with clients, and I'll use it in my own life as well, is looking at an activating event or trigger, looking at the belief or thought that it causes, looking at the consequences, which are usually the emotions. And then after going through that, going, was this realistic? Was this helpful? And then restructuring that belief or thought. So this is an example of cognitive restructuring here. So I'm going to go through an example with you briefly. Sarah, we're going to call her, has a history of panic attacks. Okay. One day she's at the grocery store and she begins to feel dizzy and short of breath. Her mind starts to race. I'm going to pass out. People's going to think that I'm crazy if I do that. And so she feels really overwhelmed and she starts to head toward the exit of the store. So using cognitive restructuring, Sarah would go through this kind of process I mentioned. She would identify the thought first. I'm going to pass out. People will think I'm crazy. Then we need to challenge the thought for Sarah. Have I passed out in the store before? Nope. Have people thought that I'm crazy in past panic attacks that I know of? Nope. What evidence do I have that I will pass out now? Usually there isn't any. Sarah will replace with a realistic thought. Like, this is just my body reacting to anxiety. The feelings are uncomfortable, but they are not dangerous. I've managed this before. I can manage it now. And so as Sarah practices that process over and over, she becomes more confident in her ability to handle the panic attacks that she fears, and her avoidance of the grocery store then diminishes. And eventually she may even be able to go to the store without fear of a panic attack at all. So that just gives you a bit of an example of a cognitive restructuring process. Okay, now we're going to go into talking a little bit about relaxation, breathing, and mindfulness. In terms of what relaxation, breathing, and mindfulness is, I'm sure you know to some degree, but I'm going to break it down a little bit. So what relaxation, breathing, and mindfulness can do is it can calm the mind and body. It can reduce negative thinking. And when we are able to calm the mind and body, we're able to reduce some of that negative thinking. We can then increase the awareness that we have in our brain of the moment that is present. We're not thinking in the past or future anymore. And then when we can do that, we're able to then regulate our emotions on a much better level. So relaxation techniques really have a goal of reducing physical tension. They regulate the nervous system. And when we regulate the nervous system, those psychological symptoms tend to also be regulated or reduced. An example of this might be progressive muscle relaxation or guided visualization. Those two things can be looked up on a website like YouTube, where you can follow through with them to do either of those exercises. In the green here, we've got the breathing. So breathing exercises also reduce physiological symptoms like panic. Again, a couple examples of that: deep breathing, box breathing, 4-7-8 breathing, all things that can be searched up as well on YouTube to try out. And third, looking at mindfulness in general. So before I even define mindfulness, I'm going to acknowledge the stigma that exists with mindfulness, because every time I'll bring it up, I'll get like an eye roll oftentimes from a client, because we've got this misconception that mindfulness is always this, I've heard clients go, oh, it's for hippies or whatever it is. And it's like, no, like it isn't always the Buddha or the that has to do with it, right? It's literally just living in the moment. So the way that Oxford Dictionary defines mindfulness is a mental state achieved by focusing one's awareness on the present moment while calmly acknowledging and accepting one's feelings, thoughts, and body sensations. And I will admit, before I went into school and started looking at this stuff, I was one of the ones that would roll their eyes because it's very much painted as society as being this like cliche thing. But really, every single day, we need to try to be more mindful and live in the present. And it's a lot more simple than what we might kind of play it out to be in the media and things like that. We're going to try a demonstration of a relaxation technique here in a few minutes. Now, from a cognitive behavioral therapy perspective, homework is also an integral part of the therapeutic process. It helps bridge that gap between what is learned in therapy sessions and the real world application of those skills. An example that I'll often use in my sessions is a broken ankle. So oftentimes we can better understand a physical ailment. And so I'll usually use this. So let's say you go to the doctor, you've got a broken ankle, you've got your x-ray done, and he's like, okay, non-weight bearing plaster cast, elevate it, ice it, whatever that might be. And they're like, okay, 6 days of that, you're doing that. You decide to listen to the doctor for the first 6 days. But on the 7th day, you go and you run a 10-kilometer marathon. Does the ankle heal? No, it doesn't. And so it's the same with therapy. We can't just go to therapy an hour a week and then not do anything in between. And that's kind of where that homework aspect comes into play. And so let's talk a little bit about the main reasons why homework is important in CBT. So first and foremost, it promotes skill development and promotes the mastery of those skills. So CBT emphasizes learning new skills and challenging and changing unhelpful thoughts and behaviors. It gives that structured way to practice those skills outside of therapy, and it really fosters that mastery through repetition and real world application. It encourages active participation as well, engages clients in actively participating in their treatment, and it shifts some of that responsibility for progress to the client as well and empowers them to take ownership of their change process. It also reinforces some learning concepts. So some things like today that we're learning, you're able to put into practice in between sessions as well. It promotes the application of skills in a real world setting as well, or an uncontrolled environment. So in the therapy room, we can come up with a lot of examples that are based on kind of the reality, but we don't necessarily get to apply it in the real world or in a natural kind of environment. And homework allows for an individual to do that between session. Homework also provides some valuable data that we're able to use as well in therapy. So it's really helpful to us as well, where we're able to, maybe look at thoughts that you've tracked or behaviors or emotions. And then those records give us and you as a client valuable data to analyze patterns, to refine strategies, to measure progress, things like that. Homework also enhances your ability to showcase self-efficacy and to build confidence. And so completing homework builds that confidence in a person's ability to handle challenges. And then that increase of self-efficacy is really that core goal of CBT in a nutshell, because it then empowers you to manage your mental health independently as well. In addition to that, it very much as homework facilitates change between sessions, because sessions are typically limited to like an hour a week. And so while the rest of the time is spent outside the therapist's office. So homework, like I said, ensures that the client is able to continue making progress during those days in between. Homework also encourages insight. Reflective homework exercises like journaling or thought logs also help you to gain a deeper insight into what your thought patterns are, your emotions, your experiences, your behaviors. And when we're aware of something, it's a really critical first step in then changing some of those patterns. If we're not aware, then where does the change come from? So in summary, homework in CBT is not just a supplement, but it's a fundamental concept of the therapy process. It transforms therapy from a passive session-based experience into a really active and ongoing practice that drives meaningful change. So it's, as much as we want to look at homework also with stigma, it's very, very, very important in CBT for things like panic disorder and agoraphobia. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly have a quick chat about internet-delivered cognitive behavior therapy. So ICBT is an effective treatment option because it's very easily accessible, and it's one that we can help a greater number of clients at any given time. For example, individuals with mobility issues or lack of access to mental health services because maybe they live more remote. But client adherence is really key in an ICBT program as well. Another factor that may play a role as well is looking at some of the, charger fell. Looking at socioeconomic conditions that are ideal for panic disorder and agoraphobia. A lot of times there's like a barrier in healthcare for achieving those kinds of things. A study that was done that I read by Andrew Zayal, it found that efficacy rate of ICBT is actually 75% or more. So it is more beneficial than not. I do recognize as a therapist that in-person sessions are preferred for most people. It adds that bit of routine and that physical aspect of coming into the office and having that face-to-face relationship. But knowing that this is an option and that it is 75% or more effective is really great discovery to have made, and has become really, really popular. Okay. So I'm going to have a brief chat here again about COVID-19 related implications. So prior to 2020, if people had been working to improve their symptoms of agoraphobia, let's say, COVID-19 halted it like drastically and potentially influenced a relapse as well. We're trying with cognitive therapy to get people out and about with agoraphobia because that's their exposure. And it was illegal for people to be doing that for a period of time. The government was telling you not to expose yourself to the public. And so the pandemic has changed many lives. COVID is an uncontrollable event that tends to affect people in a lot of negative ways. And the pandemic has really made individuals feel more anxious, made them feel more lost, hopeless, frustrated, abandoned. So being forced to stay home can be an example of agoraphobia because being contained within your living space may replicate the effects of being trapped in a small environment. Being socially distant, confined to one's home, can make individuals with panic disorder or agoraphobia feel as if the walls are closing in around them and as if they're locked up with their anxious feelings and they don't have an escape. The impacts and the effects of the pandemic are very similar to agoraphobia's short and long-term impacts as well, which unfortunately are all sadly influenced negatively by the pandemic. So in an individual who suffers with agoraphobia, their symptoms will and do increase as a result, and it can become very, very dangerous. Now I'd like to talk for a moment about the role of the therapeutic alliance. Success of treatment is dependent on factors of delivery. Therapist treatment must be rational and must be adherent, and the therapeutic alliance is crucial. So research has really demonstrated that CBT interventions are highly effective in treating panic disorder and agoraphobia, but there needs to be a therapeutic alliance in place as well, and ensure that an individual understands that. So as I say to my clients when I do informed consent procedures with them in the first session, I can't expect anyone to come into a space to share those deepest parts of themselves, the most vulnerable parts of themselves in their life with me, if they don't feel that the relationship is based on safety and trust. Because without those two things, being comfortable while discussing the uncomfortable is near impossible. So we need to be sure that there's that level of comfort, which sometimes takes time. Sometimes it means that you switch therapists if it isn't a good fit. There's no bad client, there's no bad therapist. Sometimes they're just not good for one another. So we just need to really make sure that the therapeutic alliance is there, because that also has a major influence on how the level of efficacy for cognitive behavioral therapy for things like panic disorder or agoraphobia. Okay, now I'm going to do my brief demonstration before we conclude. Again, there's no pressure to have to do this, no obligation to do it. It involves making yourself comfortable, and I'm going to read something to you myself here. I'm going to turn off my camera so that there's no concern of having to awkwardly look at me. I acknowledge it can be awkward, and that's okay. It's very difficult to be mindful and to relax. You're in an anonymous, safe space, though. It's a little bit of a demonstration for you. So become comfortable, listen to my voice for a short time, and I will be back shortly. Okay. So I want you all to take notice of your physical position right now. You might be standing, sitting, lying down, moving around. Just notice where your body is. Now, if you want to, you can make some adjustments to be more comfortable. You may want to sit down or stretch a bit, lie down if you like. Just allow yourself to become slightly more physically comfortable. So now that you're in a more comfortable position, you can observe your environment. Is there any immediate danger there? Is there something that will cause you harm? You can take action to keep yourself safe. If there's no immediate threat to your life, I can assure you that right now you're safe from harm. The panic that you're experiencing is not going to hurt you. Although it might feel like you're in danger because of this anxiety, and it's completely normal to feel that way, you're not in danger. This anxiety will not harm you. Anxiety attacks can be scary, but they will pass. This anxiety will pass. Overcoming panic attacks is possible. You're breathing, and you're getting enough air. If you weren't, you wouldn't be conscious right now listening. Your body knows how much air it needs. If it feels like you cannot catch your breath right now, you probably are breathing a great deal of air in, but not exhaling enough. We can fix that. Blow out through your lips as if you're blowing air through a straw. Hear the air whoosh out, emptying your lungs completely. Notice how your lungs naturally refill without any effort as you automatically breathe in. And then exhale again through your mouth, blowing the air out. And in and out. And keep breathing naturally, making sure to exhale completely with each and every breath. Now remember, you're okay right now. Panic attack symptoms are unpleasant, but they're not dangerous. You aren't in any danger, even if you feel physical discomfort. You might notice that the anxiety is starting to decrease. If the anxiety has not begun to lessen yet, know that it will very soon. Anxiety cannot last forever. It's impossible for your body to maintain this state forever. Sooner or later, no matter what you do, you will feel calmer. Overcoming panic attacks is possible. Perhaps your muscles are becoming a little more relaxed. See how you can lower your shoulders to a neutral position. They were probably raised and tense a few moments ago, but now you can hold them lower, looser, as the muscles on the tops of your shoulders become a bit longer and a bit more relaxed. Even your jaw is probably loosening, relaxing, allowing your mouth to be relaxed and loose, your teeth not touching. Feel your breathing slowing, becoming ever so slightly slower, deeper. Your breathing is quiet, quiet and calm. Your thoughts may be calmer now too. If you would like to repeat some affirmations to help your thoughts become even more calm, you can repeat the following phrases after I say them. Or if you like, you can simply just continue to listen and relax. Let's begin those affirmations now. I am safe right now. Overcoming panic attacks is possible. I am able to deal with this. I know that anxiety cannot hurt me. Anxiety is a natural and normal process, and it will pass. It is okay to be anxious. It is okay to not like feeling anxious. I accept the way I feel right now, good or bad. It is perfectly safe to have a racing heart. And I can feel my heartbeat becoming slow and regular. I know that I'm getting enough air. My muscles are starting to relax. My muscles feel light, my eyelids feel heavy, and I'm starting to feel calm. I am more relaxed right now than I was a moment ago. My relaxation increases with each passing moment. My fears cannot hurt me right now. My mind can focus on images of peace and safety. I can picture a relaxing place right now. I can imagine what it would feel like to be completely relaxed. I can imagine what it would feel like if my hands were relaxed. I can imagine how heavy my arms would feel if I were relaxed. I can imagine what relaxation feels like. I can imagine a feeling of relaxation filling my body and my mind. My whole body is starting to feel relaxed and heavy. Again, I am safe right now. I am feeling calmer. There's nothing I need to do to feel more relaxed. My body and mind can relax all on their own. Now that you've heard some affirmations, you may notice that you're a bit more calm than you were even before. You will probably find that you're feeling relaxed, maybe a bit sleepy. To further deepen your relaxation and allow you to achieve a state of complete tranquility, you can count their breaths too as they arrive. Without trying to change your breathing in any way, simply notice each breath as the air goes smoothly in and out of your body. Take a breath in, and as you breathe out, say 1 in your mind. And wait for the next breath, and as you exhale, count 2. And continue to count each breath for the next few moments. Keep counting as I talk. If you lose count anywhere along the way, simply begin again at 1. It doesn't matter how many breaths you can count or how fast or slow your breathing is. Simply turn your attention to each breath and see how your body breathes naturally without any input from you. Notice and count each breath for a moment. You're now feeling deeply relaxed and comfortable, calm, safe, peaceful. Notice how you can use affirmations and relaxation to handle panic attacks and decrease symptoms of anxiety and panic. Overcoming panic attacks is possible. Relaxation is effective in overcoming panic attacks. Notice how you naturally return to a state of calm. Memorize this relaxed state. You can return to this relaxed feeling anytime you need to. When you're ready to resume your regular activities, allow your mind and body to reawaken while maintaining a feeling of calm. Let your muscles reawaken by rolling your shoulders. Now turn your head. Move your arms and legs a little. Return your attention to your surroundings, noticing where you are. Take in the environment around you. And when you return to your usual level of alertness and wakefulness, you can resume your usual activities, feeling calm. Okay. This is being a little silly, but we're almost done anyway, so as long as you can still see. I'm going to turn my camera back on. Okay. So like I said, I acknowledge sometimes that kind of stuff can be awkward. And I know a lot of the references in there were referring to if you had been having a panic attack right before or close to having one. And I really hope that the presentation didn't trigger one. But it was just a demonstration and an example of a guided relaxation exercise, and one that you can say in your own head as well when worried about that. Okay, so in conclusion, the efficacy of psychological treatments of panic disorder with or without agoraphobia has extensively demonstrated CBT's positive and effective treatment that found large effects on measures of anxiety, clinically significant change, and significant symptom improvement. So as discussed throughout kind of this presentation, research has demonstrated that CBT exposure-based interventions are very effective in treating individuals who may struggle with panic disorder and or agoraphobia. And research has also shown that the exposure activities which are delivered through the therapeutic relationship suggest that both the therapist and the client adherence to CBT protocols and manuals for treatment are important. And the therapeutic alliance plays a really key role in achieving positive outcomes. And in light of the COVID pandemic and its subsequent negative impact on mental health, that internet-delivered cognitive behavior therapy for treating agoraphobia is effective, and it's an accessible option, and can really be successful as well. CBT is effective for treating agoraphobia and panic disorder. However, some future research we hope will examine some more on how to increase that efficacy and sustainable long-term benefits for these individuals, as we know the impact that it has on an individual's life. So questions, comments, concerns. Like I said, we're going to stop recording in a minute to see if there's any that are in real time. However, I've put both my clinic email and just my counseling therapist email here on the screen if you'd like to take note of that for any questions, comments, or concerns. We'll also be, like I said, sending out those surveys for questions, comments, or feedback as well. So just stay tuned on that. A little bit of a funny comic because that's kind of who I am. Had to throw a little something in there. I just want to say that I really appreciate the time that you've all set aside to join me here today, and I really look forward to connecting with you or seeing you at another webinar in the future.